London 1832. Die Royal Academy hat geladen zur Jahresausstellung. In 2 Tagen wird eröffnet. Die Spannung steigt. Hier werden Künstlerkarrieren gemacht und ihre Bilder hängen Seite an Seite. William Turner und John Constable, die größten Rivalen der englischen Malerei. Constable will Turner endlich in den Schatten stellen mit einer grandiosen Ansicht der Waterloo Bridge. Doch Turner erkennt schnell, sein kleines Seestück wirkt uninspiriert daneben. Etwas fehlt. Kurz vor der Eröffnung malt er eine Boje in die schäumenden Wellen. Ein Geniestreich. Die rote Boje wird der Gesprächsstoff. Und Constable steht im Schatten Turners. Mal wieder. Kann er jemals Englands größter Landschaftsmaler werden?
Turner had a meteoric rise to success and Constable didn't.
It's inevitable that they had an eye on each other.
We see Constable and Turner today as key rivals.
It's almost impossible to overestimate Turner because he was so extraordinary. He's seen in this country really as a kind of national painter.
So there's no doubt that Constable was pro-establishment and conservative, but in art, he was radical and revolutionary.
His output was a function of the sagas and dramas and tragedies and triumphs of his private life.
I think he does feel in the shadow of Turner because all the critics talk about Turner.
One needs to put a bit more effort into, you know, keeping Constable up there.
London 1802. Hier kreuzen sich die Wege von Joseph Mallord William Turner und John Constable erstmals. Constable vollendet sein Studium an der Royal Academy, während Turner bereits Mitglied der Akademie wird, mit 26 Jahren jüngster in der Geschichte der renommierten Institution. Hier ein- und auszugehen, das bedeutet Anerkennung und Einfluss in einer extrem konkurrenzgetriebenen Kunstszene. Davon ist der 1 Jahr jüngere Constable weit entfernt. Der Junge aus der Provinz hat in Turner seinen Rivalen schon gefunden, lange bevor er sich selbst einen Namen machen kann.
The Royal Academy in London was absolutely essential to an artist. Your career progress would probably be, as it was for Turner, starting as a student there in your teens.
Landschaftsmalerei spielt im Studium noch keine Rolle. Es heißt ganz klassisch Figuren zeichnen. Denn angesagt ist die Historienmalerei als ranghöchste Kunstgattung. Noch. Für Constable ist das Studium schon ein großer Schritt. Der Kampf um die Zugehörigkeit zur Akademie, deren Mitglied Turner schon ist, sollte zu seiner Lebensaufgabe werden.
It was a love-hate thing for him. There's no doubt he admired the Royal Academy. For him, the Royal Academy was the place he wanted to be.
Turner was totally established. He was embraced by the Academy. And then this painter starts to appear on his radar, who's also a landscape painter.
Turner und Constable bilden ihre Heimat ab, jeder auf seine Weise. Die Sicht der Engländer auf ihr Land ist bis heute auch vom Blick dieser beiden Maler geprägt.
Turner, by default, is perceived as somebody as having modernist tendencies, whereas Constable, by default, is now seen as somebody who has almost backward-looking tendencies.
2 Welten prallen da aufeinander. 2 Ideologien auch.
On the morning of the vote, when we were all rather depressed to hear that Britain had voted for Brexit, somebody said to me, knowing I was a Constable specialist, "Well, Annie, what do you think Constable would have voted?" And I put my head in my hands and I said, I think he would have voted Brexit. Probably.
I have absolutely no doubt that Constable would have voted for it. Turner, I don't know. I sort of got this image he would have been a bit too busy to vote, really. He'd be sort of more interested in who was potentially interested in buying one of his paintings and how much money he was going to make.
Julian Parry malt Landschaften, in der Tradition von in erster Linie John Constable. Anders als bei seinem Vorgänger fällt Parrys Blick auf die vom Menschen bedrohte Natur. Doch damals wie heute, einer Herausforderung müssen sich alle englischen Landschaftsmaler stellen.
We were a rural society who were dependent upon the landscape, engaged with the landscape, and a landscape that was changing more than most other countries in terms of the weather. This is a sort of elephant in the room, is the English weather. The profundity of the changing seasons and the unpredictability of Britain's maritime climate has probably given the Brits an unhealthy interest in the weather and in its effect on the lighting and the appearance of their country.
Trotz der unberechenbaren Witterung wird die Landschaftsmalerei zur wichtigsten Gattung in England, dank Constable und Turner. Petworth House ist ein Landsitz mit grandioser Kunstsammlung. Andrew Laux ist hier Kurator.
Turner once said a very profound thing as the professor of perspective at the Royal Academy. The soil is English, and so should be the harvest. He meant it was about time that the British landscape became as worthy of representation as, say, for example, the Italian landscape. Turner repackaged the British landscape, which was certainly in the 18th century thought to be really only worthy of very simple watercolor drawings, certainly not big oil paintings.
Die Neubelebung der Landschaftsmalerei trifft den Nerv der Zeit. Woher kommt das gestiegene Interesse der Briten an der Darstellung ihrer Heimat?
In the 18th century, the whole idea of the topographical landscape did seem to become a particularly British thing. So this idea of mapping and chronicling the British landscape really did grow as a sort of national preoccupation. People began to take a far greater interest in the British landscape because of the war with France. People began to make tourism within this country. The British subject matter became very popular and found a much readier market.
Auf die napoleonischen Kriege folgt eine Phase starken nationalen Bewusstseins in Europa. Die Künstler werden zu Stiftern nationaler Identität, indem sie ihre Heimat abbilden. Auch in Julian Parrys Kunst geht es um das Bewahren originär britischer Motive. Er thematisiert die Erosion der Küsten und das Aussterben der Ulme, die schon Constable und Turner liebten, weil sie die englische Landschaft jahrhundertelang geprägt hat.
There was a profound turning point with the change between the 18th and the 19th century. Philosophically, it can be described as the transition between the age of reason and the age of observation. In the 18th century, nature was regarded as almost not quite good enough. The neoclassical artists had to perfect. They had to lift nature. They had to raise it into being this mirror onto a higher spiritual existence. Come the 19th century, they said, hold on a minute, let's look at the way light shimmers in sunsets and just paint it real with the trees and the farmland as they actually happen. This is where Constable was way ahead of Turner, was in many ways the more ambitious artist. I don't think there's any way that Constable would have been described as a conservative painter at that time. People had a different expectation of what pictures would look like. Pictures would look like Italy or mountains and things that they'd probably never seen. And they might well have nymphs and angels and giants or whatever. That's what was expected.
John Constable malt die Heimat seiner Kindheit, immer wieder. Dedham Vale, Flatford Mill, der Fluss Stour. Diese Schauplätze im Osten der Insel sind verankert im kollektiven Gedächtnis der Engländer. Diese Orte kennt jeder, auch wenn er nie da war. Und jeder kennt die Bilder einer idyllisch verklärten Vergangenheit, wie Constable sie bewahren will.
The sound of water escaping from mill dams, so do willows, old rotten banks, slimy posts and brickwork. I love such things. I should paint my own places best. Painting is but another word for feeling. The fact that he continued to be so dedicated to these, what he called his native scenes, has made his name to this day because we talk about Constable Country.
Constables Vater ist Mühlenbesitzer. Sein Sohn soll das gut laufende Korngeschäft erben, doch der will lieber Kunst studieren. Das tut er auch, unter einer Bedingung. Er soll ein erfolgreicher Künstler werden.
To be successful, in his parents' terms, meant aiming towards becoming, if you like, a history painter, or maybe painting portraits, which paid good money. I have to say that Constable didn't sell many paintings during his lifetime.
William Turner ist rastlos, getrieben. Er schafft Kunst mit ungeheurem inneren Antrieb. Er ist ein beseeltes Genie, das die Welt abbilden muss. Gleichzeitig treibt ihn die Angst, überflügelt zu werden von den anderen. Er wird in einfachen Verhältnissen groß. Der erste Ausstellungsort des Wunderkindes ist der Friseursalon des Vaters. Heute hat ein Großteil von Turners Nachlass ein prominentes Zuhause. Die Tate Britain.
How many Turners was Turner? How many people was he wrapped up in one? Many, I think.
Mitverantwortlich für den Turner-Nachlass ist David Blaney Brown, Kurator an der Tate Britain.
You can look at it over time and see how it changes, or you can take a particular year, perhaps, and think of what he was exhibiting in just that single year. Many artists are just portrait painters, they're just marine painters, they just paint the sea, or they just paint landscape, or they just paint narrative or history. Turner did everything.
Landschaften und Seestücke sind die Lieblingsthemen des unfassbar produktiven Künstlers. Ob in Öl oder Aquarell, Turners Darstellung variiert von gegenständlich bis zu abstrakt aufgelöster Form. In Farbe und Licht von Sonne, Feuer, Wasser und Nebel gibt er dem Begriff der Impression neue Bedeutung.
The emotional impact of Turner covers such a range of feelings. It involves memory, affection for a landscape or a place. It involves a sense of history and the past, the associations contained within a particular landscape or a particular place.
Mit dem Ende der Napoleonischen Kriege macht sich Turner auf zum Kontinent. Das Reisen sensibilisiert ihn für die Lichtverhältnisse in unterschiedlichen Regionen, das Wetter, Tages- und Jahreszeiten, die Natur im ständigen Wandel.
He tended to travel with his coat stuffed full of 4 or 5 sketchbooks, and he would pull them out at random and make sketches in them. And so the sketchbooks are a kind of running commentary of what he's seeing. The summers, he would spend sometimes months at a time traveling around, and then he'd bring back the raw material from the travels to his London house in the winter and work in the studio, turning them into pictures.
Constable arbeitet anders und er bleibt lieber zu Hause.
He never travelled abroad, unlike Turner. But if he had, and recorded the scenes in France or Italy, and of course the scenes in Italy had been so popular with British artists in the 18th century, I think he felt that that would have been dishonest to him. He painted Brighton and Hampstead. Why? Because that's where he lived.
Seiner Frau Mariah und den Kindern nach Hampstead Heath, einem grünen Vorort Londons mit besserer Luft. Denn Constables Ehefrau zeigt erste Anzeichen einer Tuberkuloseerkrankung.
Constable had a lot of family pressure. Unlike Turner, he was always late with his submissions to the Royal Academy. He was always tearing his hair out. The children were ill. He'd never quite finished. The paint wasn't dry. The picture wasn't varnished.
Mit über 40 Jahren bekommt Constable noch immer nicht die erhoffte Wertschätzung der Akademie. Wie macht das bloß dieser Turner?
Constable couldn't help but be dazzled by this presiding genius who was winning all the prizes and all the publicity, who could even get bad publicity and it turned into something that just made him even more famous and more prosperous.
Kann Constable seinen konsequenten Weg einfach immer so weitergehen? Den in seinen Augen einzig richtigen Weg?
He was so rejected by the Academy. Everyone was saying, hold on a minute, you can't just paint a horse standing by the side of a canal or river. That's not good enough. You know, we need a bit of history, we need a bit of symbolism. He said, no, I think England is so beautiful, I want to just paint it. He wanted to look at the prosaic, the ordinary, and make it into something special.
Turner und Constable, zwei künstlerische Zeitgenossen mit völlig verschiedenen Karrieren, Lebenswegen und Haltungen. Nationale Ikonen heute. In wessen Kunst erkennen sich die Briten wieder? Wer eröffnet in seiner Kunst eine Welt, die wirklich berührt?
Turner&Constable.
Oh, it's a very difficult one. There's such very different artists. Constable is much more chocolate box, English, although Turner is very associated with England. I think he's more abstract, more interesting, more intriguing artist.
I've heard of William Turner. I think I have a... No, I don't think I have a Turner in there. It'd be too expensive.
I think, yes, I'd find more of my own truth, yeah, in Turner rather than Constable.
Constable was just so wonderful the way he captured that quintessential English countryside.
There's nothing enigmatic about his work. It's too comfortable. It's Turner has a bit more of the Caspar David Friedrich, the sublime.
When I see a painting by Constable or Turner, I feel free. That's the best emotion I get. Because they were people who were alone, sitting on a seaside or in the forest or in some place where they're so free. And I think that is the independence an Englishman likes. And that's what I feel when I see their paintings.
Turner will seine Arbeiten bei jeder Gelegenheit präsentieren. Als umtriebiger Geschäftsmann richtet er in seinem Haus in London eine eigene Galerie ein. Er will unabhängiger sein, denn mit den Ausstellungen der Royal Academy entwickelt sich ein öffentlicher Diskurs, eine Kunstkritik, die auch ihn immer wieder angreift. Doch Turner will alle neuen Arbeiten ausstellen können. Er ist ein Meister darin, sich die nötigen Freiheiten für seine Kunst zu verschaffen.
He didn't marry. He did have some mistresses and girlfriends and probably produced some children, but he never a single relationship that seems to have been based on any real affection. He essentially lived for his work. So in some sense, he's quite emotionally buttoned up and perhaps quite repressed. And I don't imagine that when he was busy doing that, he had a great deal of time for his living companions, who were perhaps one of his mistresses who would be in and out, or his elderly father, who long since retired from his job as a barber, came to live with him and cooked and shopped and set the table, and Turner was very fond of him, but I don't imagine he saw a great deal of him. He was an artist who lived through his work, and if we imagine his day, it would mostly have been a working day, interrupted with a meal and perhaps some beer or some porter or a glass of wine.
Turner und Constable kennen sich von den Ausstellungen der Royal Academy. Haben sie dort miteinander geredet? Bei einem Dinner mit Künstlerkollegen werden sie eines Abends Seite an Seite platziert. Sie können sich austauschen, diskutieren und sich ein Bild machen vom anderen.
Constable writes to his wife, Maria. He is, as I would have expected him to be, uncouth, so not very refined, I suppose, but he has a wonderful range of mind.
Constable, mittlerweile 43 und noch immer nicht voll anerkannt von der Akademie, will endlich als Landschaftsmaler in seiner Manier ernst genommen werden. Vom Publikum wie von den Kollegen. Er braucht eine Idee.
This competition in the background all the time, but in a sense the competition never really becomes real until Constable becomes more like Turner's equal. And frankly, that's not until he starts painting the 6-foot landscapes.
Heuwagen ist die bekannteste aus Constables Reihe großformatiger Arbeiten mit mindestens 1,80 Meter in der Breite. Die Idee dahinter ist so simpel wie einleuchtend. Constable will Aufsehen erregen auf der Jahresausstellung der Royal Academy. Vorab fertigt er Ölskizzen im identischen Riesenformat. So etwas hatte es noch nicht gegeben. In der Skizze vom Heuwagen ist die Komposition schon angelegt. Seinem Lieblingssujet bleibt Constable auch hier treu. der Landschaft seiner Kindheit. Auch beim Heuwagen, den 2 schwarze Pferde durch das flache Wasser des Flusses Stour ziehen. Ziel der Reise, die Heuernte, rechts im Bild. Es ist Mittagszeit und die Szenerie schimmert in warmem Licht und intensiven Farben. Stellt man sich die Tonspur zu diesem Gemälde vor, wird die Idylle nur noch perfekter. Die Inszenierung eines idealisierten Moments aus Constables Kindheitserinnerung. Steckt der Wagen fest? Vermutlich nicht. Links tritt eine Frau aus dem Cottage, um Wasser zu schöpfen. Ein Angler schaut aus dem Gebüsch. Weiter unten lenkt ein Hund unseren Blick zum Heukarren. Die Wolken sind perfekt arrangiert. Alles ist im Einklang. Nichts stört. Doch, das Unfertige, Ungleichmäßige des Farbauftrags wurde Constable immer wieder vorgeworfen, auch beim Heuwagen. Und von der Angst getrieben, seine Bilder würden bei der Royal Academy nicht gut ankommen, arbeitete er bis kurz vor der Ausstellung daran. Die Ölbilder konnten nicht trocknen. Constable den schützenden Firnis nicht auftragen. So bekam auch der Heuwagen seine Risse mit der Zeit.
Already by the time he's painting his 6-footers, things were moving on in the countryside and there were disturbances and agrarian revolts and rick burning, and none of his pictures in the second half of his career give us any impression of that.
He's looking back at a very well-functioning rural economy that was anachronistic probably even at that time.
Warum idealisiert Constable die Landschaft seiner Kindheit über Jahrzehnte geradezu obsessiv? Wir können nur mutmaßen. Wie wohl auch Constables bester Freund John Fisher.
And he was saying it's a bit like having a recipe of lamb mutton they ate. And he said, really, don't you think you should vary your subject matter as to time of day or content? You know, it's a little bit like being served a dish of mutton with mutton on the side, mutton on the top, mutton underneath. And Constable replied in a letter, no, thank you very much. He said, I feel I am driving a nail or banging a nail, and all I care about is driving the nail home.
Petworth House und Park, westlich von Brighton. Das ist eine sehr gute Adresse für Künstler im 19. Jahrhundert. Denn hier residiert Lord Egremont, ein wohlhabender wie auch großzügiger Kunstsammler und Mäzen. Er gibt Werke direkt bei den Künstlern in Auftrag und füllt so nach und nach das Herrenhaus, oft mit Ansichten von Petworth. In den 1820er Jahren lässt Egremont einen extra Flügel für seine Kunstsammlung errichten. Bosch, Tizian, Van Dyck, Gainsborough und Turner sind bis heute Teil dieser Sammlung. Den Künstlern stehen die Türen in Petworth offen. Manche werden Teil des Familienlebens, wie auch William Turner, der in den 20er und 30er Jahren regelmäßig herkommt. Während Constable noch vergeblich um Anerkennung kämpft, verkehrt Turner schon in den höchsten Kreisen.
Really, from early on in his career, he managed to impress several very wealthy clients, one of whom was the third Earl of Egremont at Petworth. That's really quite unlike the career path of Constable, who struggled much more, really, to gain that level of patronage. And I think the reason is Turner was much happier to work to commission. Of course, Turner was a very adventurous artist. He was far more capable of operating in different ways to suit different jobs.
William Turner bekommt in Petworth ein eigenes Atelier, er kann ungestört arbeiten. Lord Egremont und Turner werden gute Freunde.
Later in the 1820s, he produced the 2 views of the park for the carved room, which were a far more dynamic and modern type of commission, because the 4 paintings in that room all developed as a sort of partnership between the patron and the artist. And in that sense, the room operates far more like a modern installation than the sort of thing that you generally experienced in the early 19th centuries.
Endlich! Gold für Constable. Beim Pariser Salon im Louvre. Der Heuwagen hat die Franzosen begeistert. Constable wird gefeiert. Der König von Frankreich will ihm die Medaille persönlich überreichen. Eugène Delacroix findet Constables unregelmäßigen Pinselstrich furchtbar aufregend und malt nun ebenso. England ist plötzlich hip in Paris. Doch
Constable stayed at home. He could have collected his award, but he made jokes about the French. You know, I think he was a bit of a little Englander, really, but perhaps rather insular. They love all things British. Little Englander might be somebody who doesn't like garlic, but that might mean they won't even try garlic because they're prejudiced because it's French.
Ein Franzose kauft schließlich den Heuwagen. Constables großformatige Landschaften sind offenbar eine gute künstlerische Idee.
It's inevitable that they had an eye on each other. Turner was watching Constable coming up behind him in the rear-view mirror, and Turner, being the painter that he is, would have paid very close attention to that for fear of his star being dimmed in some way.
Die britische Landschaft haben beide gemalt und damit Erinnerungsbilder geschaffen. Bilder einer Welt, die so nicht mehr existiert. Die Darstellung von Flatford Mill, der Mühle von Constables Vater, ist zu einer englischen Ikone geworden.
You know from visitor analysis of Flatford Mill, people who visit the landscape today, many of them actually aren't so familiar with who Constable was, but somehow subconsciously they've come to recognize that landscape as archetypically English. So it's a very profound impact that Constable has had on our national perception of our own land.
My grandpa really enjoyed copying other artists, especially Turner and Constable. And then sort of sadly when he passed away, his house was full of hundreds of these landscape paintings. We didn't really know what to do with them. So we thought, well, maybe we'll sell them on eBay.
My father was an airline pilot all his life. He also flew aerobatics, so I spent my life as a child looking up in the skies at my father flying aeroplanes. And over our mantelpiece was a Turner painting. It was with boats in the water and this beautiful sky. And
they actually turned out to be really quite popular, especially the ones by Constable, actually. There was actually one particular one, the Hay Vane.
The first Constable painting I came across in my lifetime, like so many English, so many British people, I would probably have seen the Hay Vane as a reproduction on a jigsaw puzzle.
The Turner's such an extraordinary form of landscape. Even in the 1970s when I was growing up. And as a child, I accepted that and enjoyed it. And it was part of the furniture of the history of art there was this chap called Turner.
It's the Chichester Canal. And that's actually a painting that's in Petworth House where I now work. But it's actually one of my earliest memories as a child because this reproduction was owned by my parents and it used to hang above the dining room table.
Would I rather live with a Constable on the wall or a Turner on the wall? That would be an impossible question to answer. I couldn't choose.
Constable always said he would always have wanted to own a Turner picture. You want to live with it because they're so good.
Die Fighting Temeraire wird zu ihrem letzten Ankerplatz geschleppt, um verschrottet zu werden. Das ist das Lieblingsbild der Engländer. Auf Platz 2 übrigens der Heuwagen. 1839 malt Turner die Temeraire. 34 Jahre nach Nelsons siegreicher Seeschlacht von Trafalgar wird sie nicht mehr gebraucht. Das Segelschiff ist aus der Zeit gefallen. Die Epoche der Dampfschifffahrt hat begonnen. Turner faszinierten Zeitenwenden, Übergänge zu gänzlich Neuem. So wird die einst ruhmreiche Temeraire als geisterhaft, blasses Schlachtschiff von einem weit kleineren, kompakten Dampfschiff ins Schlepptau genommen. Der Schlepper spiegelt sich im Wasser. Turner setzt einen dunklen Rotakzent. Er kommt auf den Betrachter zu, ein farblicher Kontrast zur dramatisch untergehenden Sonne mit ihren kegelförmigen Farbflächen. Die Sonne ist eine Lichtflutung, die alles durchdringt. Ja, die alle Farbe in der Szene überhaupt erst möglich zu machen scheint. Turner ist fasziniert vom Effekt, den der wechselnde Sonnenstand auf Himmel, Meer und Landschaft hat. Er malt auf weißem Grund. Nicht wie die alten Meister mit dunkler Grundierung zu Beginn, ließ seine Bilder noch heller erstrahlen. William Turner setzt mit der letzten Reise des alten Schlachtschiffes ein neues Geschichtsbild in Szene. Verknüpft Englands Vergangenheit als Herrscher über die Meere mit seiner Zukunft als Industrienation. Sie kennt die Werke von William Turner wie kaum jemand sonst auf der Insel. Joyce Townsend, Restauratorin an der Tate Britain. Hier werden Turners Gemälde vor der Konservierung genauestens untersucht. Jedes Gemälde erzählt seine eigene Lebensgeschichte.
The older a painting gets, the more it's unique because it has aged in a certain way. It's got cracks. It reflects the history. Did it live in a nice environment like an art gallery, or did it live in a terrible one like Turner's studio, which was damp and crowded and dusty and neglected? Turner used lots of different materials, so there's just a look that Turners have. You recognise this paint. Obviously, everyone else at that time could have used it too. They didn't use it quite the same way. And a lot of them brushed it more directly, using the tip of the brush, as you would. But Turner worked really fast. He didn't know what he was going to paint exactly until he knew he'd got there. And sometimes you find fingerprints, often right-handed fingerprints. Turner was right-handed, and he's supposed to have kept a fingernail long so that he could scratch. You could actually smear off the paint. You could do that, or you could use your fingers. He did long brush strokes with his whole arm.
Der Gesundheitszustand von Constables Frau Mariah verschlechtert sich zusehends. Sie kämpft mit Fieber und Atemnot. Mariah will die Symptome ihrer Lungeninfektion lindern und schlägt vor, an die Südküste zu ziehen. In der Hoffnung, an der Seeluft ginge es ihr wieder besser. Constable, der alles tut, um ihr zu helfen, geht auf den Vorschlag ein. Sie packen ihre Koffer und ziehen um. Ins Seebad Brighton. Ein Zeichen der starken Liebe Constables zu seiner Frau. Noch vor der Heirat war Mariah in den Ferien nach Brighton gefahren. Sie liebte es und schrieb ihm, was für ein Spaß es dort sei. Er antwortete zurückhaltend. Er sei noch nie in einem Seebad gewesen. Aber er hätte gehört, es könne amüsant sein. Trotz seiner Vorbehalte sollte Constable in Brighton ein ganz neues Sujet für sich entdecken. Das frühere Fischerdorf erlebt als Seebad eine Blüte des Tourismus.
The benefits of sea bathing in the early 19th century were thought to be great, and Brighton was one of the key places where people went initially for medical reasons, but very quickly that became also a recreational activity, and the pier was central to that. There was a remarkable growth in entertainments. Constable was actually quite rude about Brighton. He famously described Brighton as only Piccadilly by the seaside.
Constable findet für die Familie ein Haus fernab der von ihm ungeliebten Touristenmeile rund um den Chain Pier. Mit den züchtigen und unzüchtigen Urlaubern aus allen Schichten der Gesellschaft, den Badehäusern, den Zockern, den Hunden und den Entertainment-Attraktionen für die Londoner Sommerfrischler kann er so gar nichts anfangen. Er sieht in all dem nur ein sittenloses Chaos.
As someone from a very well-to-do middle-class family, was actually quite disturbed by many of the sights which he saw in Brighton, even in those days. And actually you get a sense of that in Constable's painting of the Chain Pier, with these various social types mixing on the foreground of his composition, which looks at the pier from the beach.
Der Pier. Ein modernes Bauwerk im Mittelpunkt eines Gemäldes. Das ist etwas gänzlich Neues für den Landschaftsmaler John Constable. Auch Constable kann den Wandel Brightons vom Fischerdörfchen zum stolzen Seebad nicht ignorieren. Die Stadt hat ihn inspiriert. Er malt in 4 Jahren 150 Bilder. Für ihn ein unfassbarer Output. Nahezu zeitgleich beginnt auch Turner den Pier zu malen. Lord Egremont als Mitfinanzier des Bauwerks hat Turner beauftragt.
There's no doubt that Constable would have been in his mind because of this very recent and quite substantial painting of the same subject by his great contemporary.
There's the possibility that he felt the need that he'd got to outdo this upstart Constable, who'd done such a good job of this pier that really should have been his subject.
Zum ersten Mal kommt es zur direkten Konfrontation zwischen den Künstlerrivalen. Turner nimmt Constable nun ernst. Auch deshalb malt er die Seebrücke in seinem Bild von der anderen Seite.
With Turner's view, I think it's far more a celebration of the industry and modernity of the structure of the pier, because the pier, although it very quickly became adapted as a tourist amenity, it was originally constructed as a mooring for the cross-channel ferry. When you look closely at Turner's chain pier, you can see tiny little figures walking and parading up and down the pier, which of course became a very popular pastime very quickly.
Nur Relikte erinnern heute noch an das Originalmotiv, an dem die beiden Rivalen arbeiteten. 1896 wird die Konstruktion bei einem Seesturm zerstört.
It's hard to see much influence of Turner on Constable. Constable painted brilliant seascapes. They're absolutely spectacular. The sketches of the weather off the beach at Brighton and along the coast down in Dorset are exquisite. They achieve this incredible transition where paint becomes something else. It's like a kind of alchemy. It's simultaneously paint and the wind carrying the top of a wave away, or a rain cloud emptying itself a couple of miles out to sea. I don't think that owes anything to Turner. That is Constable's genius.
Egremont found Constable's pictures just too radical, which is interesting to us today because Constable is so much of an establishment artist now in terms of the way that we look at his pictures. The way in which Constable painted his pictures, a lot of people didn't fully understand. The subjects which interested him didn't really make sense to so many collectors of the period because the way in which he applied his paint was very rough. It didn't have the required amount of finish that people expected in the early 19th century. So although Turner's paintings are far more colourful, they actually have a greater degree of both narrative content and painterly finish to them.
Oh, hi. You got the Petworth
Yes.
book? Brilliant.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I was just interested to look at the comparison between Turner's drawings of the park and Constable's, because Constable only did these two, and they're actually far further out into the park than Turner's.
Yes.
And Turner's mainly are views around the lake or views from the house. There's no way that Turner would ever have exhibited or probably even shown these to people in his own lifetime, but to us today, they're extraordinary. The colouring of this could easily be Paul Nash in the 1920s, 1930s. They're really so modern. I mean, this is just almost abstract, isn't it?
Yeah.
And here are people having picnics or whatever around the lake, which you would expect. People used the park and the house in the same way that we use parks and houses today. They relaxed in them and enjoyed them. Constable, in his views, is far more obvious, really, but just wasn't so interested in the manufactured landscape and more interested in the surrounding villages and the rural activities and the cottages and so on.
Für Joyce Townsend von der Tate Britain ist William Turner ein Visionär.
He himself was interested in photography. Perhaps he saw that a time was coming when you could record things exactly, so why not give the impression and the feeling and the movement of the changing sky and the moving water. And from the later 19th century onwards, the French had the Impressionists, but we had one who was producing impressions as well, and earlier. Other people began to use the techniques he was using, starting with a white ground so the colours look really bright. He did the same in watercolour. He used very bright colours, and within a few years everyone else was using them too, when they never had before, because their paintings had to stand up against his as well. They were very competitive at the annual exhibition.
Die Royal Academy hat geladen zur Jahresausstellung. Wieder einmal das mit Spannung verfolgte Prozedere. Viele Künstler haben ihre Werke eingereicht und die meisten wurden abgelehnt. Die Auserkorenen hoffen nun auf die prominentesten Plätze in der Ausstellung, auch Constable und Turner. 2 Tage vor der Eröffnung haben die Künstler die Gelegenheit, vor aller Augen ihren Bildern noch den letzten Schliff zu geben. Gemüter sind erhitzt. Der Druck ist groß, denn für einige steht die künstlerische Existenz auf dem Spiel. Viele Egos duellieren sich auf engem Raum. Die große Show kann beginnen.
Turner, at that stage, had become known for his slightly theatrical performances, kind of boasting with a brush, if you like.
And he would often send pictures that were really not finished at all. And he would really produce a picture from what appeared to be a fairly incoherent sketch. And of course it was a way of showing off. It was a way of showing how quickly he could work. It was a way of showing how spontaneous he could be.
John Constable geht mit einer großformatigen Darstellung von der Waterloo Bridge in London ins Rennen.
In that particular year, the Waterloo Bridge picture was hanging next to a much smaller painting, a seascape of Helvoetsluis by J.M.W. Turner, a painting which ostensibly shows a 17th century warship heading out to sea. It was a very silvery, grey painting. Constable would probably not have paid it so much attention as he increasingly was glazing and raising the colour of his own painting of Waterloo Bridge.
Which is a very unusual subject for Constable, who of course was mainly a rural landscape painter. But this was a London scene with the Thames and a new bridge being opened and a ceremony taking place in the foreground to open the bridge.
This was an event which had happened as long ago as 1817, so it was old news. But Constable had laboured over this composition for all that time, and only eventually came to exhibit the finished picture in 1832.
In the opening of Waterloo Bridge, there's the mayor's parade of boats, and there are lots of flags, so that lots of touches of red and gold on the barges. So it's a much more colourful and intensely coloured picture than Turner would have expected from Constable.
This was a bit troubling for Turner because he was the one whose pictures usually shouted from the wall.
So Constable, bearing in mind that the Waterloo Bridge picture was such an important thing for him, worked very hard during the varnishing days to generate the maximum impact for his picture. Charles Robert Leslie, who was also a Royal Academician but Constable's biographer, who witnessed all of this happening, saw Turner walking in and walking out and looking at Constable's picture in relation to his own. And eventually Turner walked up to the canvas of his picture, and without saying a word,
he painted a red blob in the sea in the foreground of his picture. And nobody really knew what it was, except that it was obviously a quotation from the red in the Constable.
It completely destroyed the effect that Constable had been working so hard to create with his own much bigger, much grander painting.
Constable was furious, understandably, and he said...
Turner came in and he's fired a gun.
And walked out.
You know, he just left this blob there as a mysterious thing, just to get people interested and start thinking about his picture rather than Constable's. And then a little bit later he came back and he finished the blob and he turned it into a mooring buoy. Everybody ended up talking about it.
Turner had pulled it off yet again with the smallest little touch and made his red more vigorous by comparison than all the reds and golds in Constable's picture.
It was a sort of theatre of rivalry. It was their one chance to compete for attention and make sure that they were the ones who were noticed rather than another artist. So even though they might be friends in private, you know, this was war.
Endlich. Mit 52 Jahren geht Constables Lebenstraum in Erfüllung. Jahrzehntelang hat er dafür gekämpft. Er wird anerkanntes Mitglied der Royal Academy, gewählt mit nur einer Stimme Mehrheit. Doch der Erfolg fühlt sich bitter an, denn seine Frau Mariah erlebt den späten Triumph nicht mehr. Es hätte ihm so viel bedeutet.
When Constable finally was elected a full Royal Academician, Turner obviously realised how much that would mean to Constable. A, because he'd struggled so long to achieve it, and B, because Constable's wife had only just died. Then, you know, as Constable said, the timing was so awful because he'd so wanted her to know that this thing he'd been struggling for all those years, and as far as Constable was concerned, it was too late to tell her.
Turner besucht Constable in dessen Haus, um mit ihm auf diesen Erfolg anzustoßen.
Of course there's competition, but at key moments in somebody's life, particularly moments of success like that, it's rather lovely that Turner went out of his way to do the decent thing and congratulate him in person. That is lovely, really, because it's that kind of empathy between artists that in the end they're all struggling for the same thing.
Mit 60 Jahren stirbt John Constable. Es heißt an Herzversagen. Und man ist bei ihm versucht zu denken, wie auch sonst. In den letzten Jahren hält er Vorlesungen an der Royal Academy. Er ist sehr beliebt bei den Studenten. Den erhofften finanziellen Erfolg hat er mit der Kunst bis zum Tod jedoch nicht.
At the end of his life, his friends and supporters were all shocked and amazed at how many paintings were still in his studio. They thought he was doing a bit better than he actually was, but all his major paintings were still unsold. As opposed to Turner, who was doing so well that he could afford to keep his own works and be very kind of sniffy about who he allowed to buy them.
Gegen Ende seines Lebens zieht sich Turner immer mehr zurück. Er reicht seine Werke nicht mehr für die Jahresausstellung ein und zeigt sich immer weniger in der Öffentlichkeit. Turners Gesundheitszustand verschlechtert sich. Er verbringt die Tage im Bett.
Turner let his house fall into terrible disrepair over the years. And I suppose, you know, when his father died, when the women in his life got older, he fell into a sort of bachelor squalor, really, and only went there very occasionally to show a few people round. And apparently you needed an umbrella because the rain was pouring in through the ceiling. It was filthy, dirty, and inhabited by a whole gang of cats that belonged to the lady who had once probably been his mistress and companion, but was now a sort of housekeeper. And she apparently had some terrible skin disease that had taken off all her hair and caused her face to become covered in lesions and so on. So she had to wear some sort of scarf around her head. So this terrifying woman, the cats, the rain pouring in through the ceiling, the filth and presumably the smell, didn't make it very appealing. And a number of the pictures were not in very good condition by the time he died.
Turner überlebt Constable um 14 Jahre. Nach seinem Tod vermacht er ausgewählte Werke der britischen Nation und verfügt, dass die Arbeiten an einem Ort ausgestellt werden sollen. Diese Schenkung wird von seinen Erben angefochten, denn Turner hat die Verwandtschaft im Testament nicht bedacht.
It wasn't just the 100 finished pictures, but it was several hundred unfinished ones, oil sketches, studies, works in progress, and so on, and the tens of thousands of works on paper. Nothing on that scale survives for Constable. He wasn't such a prolific artist. He never made so much in the first place. If he kept pictures, it's because he couldn't sell them. He didn't keep them back because he wanted them to come to the nation.
Die Wahrnehmung von Constables Kunst hat sich im Lauf der Zeit verändert. Der einst als zu radikal Missverstandene wirkt im Rückblick geradezu konventionell und verklärt.
People began to look back at Constable's work. Framed reproductions of those pictures find their way onto people's walls. And, for example, if you go into residential care homes now, all the walls are lined with reproductions of Constable's art, much more than Turner's. And I think that this is quite a problem for his reputation today, actually. People associate his art in the way that we don't want the countryside to change. NIMBY, not in my backyard. Please, no extra houses in this village. We want to keep the countryside in aspic. And that's whatever Constable may have thought about the 21st century, that's not what Constable was actually about.
The country has changed so much from what Constable represented, so a kind of nostalgia sets in, and people in this country are very prone to nostalgia. They like to live in the past, which is not always a very healthy thing. By looking at Constable's landscape paintings, people see an England that they wish still existed.
Es ist doch wunderbar. Man hat die Wahl und kann sein England durch die Kunst des einen oder des anderen repräsentiert sehen.
Both Turner and Constable are national painters, but in very different ways.
There's no doubt in my mind that Turner and Constable knew this, was more of a genius.
He greatly admired Turner. He had the utmost respect for him. I would go so far as to say was jealous of his presiding genius over the art scene.
The principal difference between the two is that Constable's achievement, ironically, was primarily celebrated more after his death.
For many people nowadays, I think probably Constable would be the more characteristic national painter because he painted people's idea of what the English landscape is, how they would like it to be, or how they would want to remember it, rather than Turner.
Doch wer hat es am Ende auf die 20-Pfund-Note geschafft? William Turner wird den Geldschein der Bank of England künftig mit seinem Konterfei zieren.
However much I defend Constable, if there's going to be a British artist on the banknote, it does have to be Turner. Of course, Turner loved money. I mean, he was really quite a greedy guy. He might have liked to be on a higher denomination note.
Turner ist heute in den Augen vieler der modernere, visionäre und wegweisende Künstler. Und das ist die Tragik von John Constable, dass er noch immer der unverstandene Nostalgiker ist.